Monotype.
Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, the show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm your host, Dan Radigan, and today I'm talking to Max Phillips. Max is a type designer and the owner of Signal Type, an independent foundry based in Dublin. He's been designing letters since he was a teenager, but his path to becoming a full-time type designer wasn't exactly typical. In this episode, I talked to Max about his journey, from designing theater posters in high school to working as a graphic designer and novelist in New York City, to eventually turning his attention to type design. It was nice to talk to someone who cares as much as I do about designing letters. In Max's words, you can hear how strong his feelings are about type design.
Once you have the kink in your head that you require to be a type designer, because you really do have to be an otaku, you really do have to be an obsessive in order to do this. You have to care passionately about tiny details in something that most people barely notice. But once you are there, there's just never, at least for me, any shortage of inspiration.
My colleague Cadley is here to preview this episode with me. Hi, Cadley.
Hi, Dan. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I'm excited to have you with me. You and I haven't done one of these together.
I fought Carl for the chance to do the intro with you, so I won.
I think I won. It's great to have you here.
You said earlier that you were inspired to work on some of your own designs this weekend after hosting this episode.
Yeah, well, day to day, I don't get to draw a lot of typefaces because I take care of other things at Monotype. But my conversation with Max really got me fired up about some of the things I've been doing on my own. So after we spoke, I spent a whole weekend obsessively drawing letters the whole time. But it was really nice to tap into that energy again.
That's awesome. I find that whenever I host the podcast, I also feel like very inspired after. So it's a nice way to kind of switch your brain. So tell me a little bit about Max's typefaces. What are they like?
Max is really good at text typefaces. What I admire about his whole library is that he doesn't restrict himself to one thing. He's explored a lot of different angles. There are good solid text typefaces, some really imaginative takes on sans serifs, and some really wild display typefaces. So he's got a really rich set of ideas going on, and then they're all beautifully crafted.
What did you and Max talk about on this episode?
Well, we really got into that craft about approaching a typeface design. I think Max and I realized we have sort of a lot in common in our background and about how much we both really care about type design. So we went a little bit deep on where inspiration comes from, what the process of sticking with a project is like, and the times when an idea has to come together quickly versus when you need to sit and take some time and let it bake. So it was really good to get a lot of different views from Max about how he approaches his work.
Interesting. I feel like those sorts of insights are kind of applicable outside of type design too. So I'm interested to hear as a non-type designer.
Yeah, I think this will be a good week for giving people a glimpse at what goes on in a designer's head and their overall thoughts about not just the profession, but the work itself.
Well, thanks so much. And let's get into your conversation with Max Phillips.
I'm here today with Max Phillips from Signal Type. Now, Max and I have been hovering around each other in online circles of the type world for a few years. We were chatting recently about when we actually met. Max, you are pretty sure that we met at Monotype's Pencil to Pixel exhibition in New York many years ago. Is that correct?
I'm pretty sure that's when it was, yeah.
That rings a bell with me. I gave so many tours during that event that it's a bit of a blur as to who I met and when, but it's certainly very plausible and it maps up to when you were certainly on my radar. I think this is very typical of how things happen in the type world with people who have been knocking around for many years, perfecting their crafts. You sort of know who other designers are, you've crossed paths, you're familiar with their work. And you often wind up just talking to someone as if you've known them forever because you're at least familiar with each other. Hi, Max. It's nice to talk to you properly. and meet you officially here in Creative Characters.
Well, thank you. It's nice to officially meet you.
So you live in Ireland now, but you were living in New York many years ago when we believe was the time we first met. What took you from New York to Ireland?
I am a New Yorker. I was born there. Well, I should say that I'm not a true New Yorker, because a true New Yorker is always born in the wilds of Michigan or Wyoming or, Uttar Pradesh, and comes to New York because there's something they want to do that they feel they can do better in New York than back where they were born, and becomes much more of a savvy New Yorker than I ever was, who just wound up getting born there. But I was born there and never intended to leave until I fell in love with an Irish woman and married her. And after 10 years in New York, she got homesick.
I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Even those of us who've lived long lives in New York
Mm-hmm.
come to the conclusion occasionally that it's time to go.
Well, yeah.
Where in New York City were you born? Where did you grow up?
I was born on the Upper West Side, Riverside and 155th Street. I've lived in a number of places in New York City, but when I was, I guess, about 5, my folks moved out to the suburbs, to Rockland County, a place I have always absolutely loathed, but made my parents, though, very happy. They're both Depression kids, and the idea of having their own house with their own front lawn and their own back lawn and trees on the back lawn that they own, that was wonderful to them, and had not known poverty, and were just thinking, God, let's go someplace where something's happening.
That's yet another parallel story. I grew up in Staten Island in New York to parents who were Depression kids who were very adamant that they live someplace quiet where they could own a house. And even though my father worked in Manhattan, he refused to go there except for his job. And I grew up desperately wanting to escape from Staten Island and explore the larger world.
Yeah, Staten Island, that is so. I mean, like a lot of New Yorkers, I think of Staten Island as this grassy bit just beyond the ferry terminal, where it's all cops and firefighters and mafiosi.
There's 2 Tony Sopranos. You've never seen the other one. That's the one I want to show to you.
I don't have a very clear idea of anything beyond that.
That's about as much as a lot of people need to know. So before you went back to Ireland, what were you doing? What's your sort of professional background before type design became your whole focus?
Well, I've been drawing letters for money. I mean, since I was a teenager, I have always been fascinated by them. And my whole life, I've been in and around the field of graphic design. So I was designing logos for friends and posters for local theatrical productions with my own lettering, as I said, when I was a teenager. I think I started designing theatrical posters because I was always having crushes on the ingenues in the productions. And I thought, if I design the poster, they'll have to invite me to the cast party. And if I go to the cast party, I might be able to do myself a bit of good. That worked out about as well as you might think, but it did teach me how to prepare artwork for reproduction. And after getting out of college, I started work as a graphic designer and continued on that way for a number of years with a few professional detours. I have also been a writer. I have published 5 novels and a bunch of poetry.
That's an exciting detail.
Yeah. After a few years in graphic design, I was so fed up with the compromises, with having to, in my view, muck my work up for the sake of people who didn't have as good an understanding of what was required for a job as I did, that I said, I can't be putting my heart into this anymore. I need to do something else. And I began to write stories.
Mm-hmm.
And for a number of years, I continued working as a graphic designer, kind of as a day job while I wrote. And that went on for, I would say, about 10, 12 years, at the end of which time I had published 5 novels and abruptly realized that I was all out of novels to write.
Oh, no.
Well, let's put it this way. I knew it was time to stop writing when I began to think, well, maybe I won't write another novel, and had a feeling of relief. Like, good, I don't have to think up another one. The difference for me between novel writing and type design is that at any given time, I have a long stack of typefaces that I would love to draw. But with novels, I was constantly thinking, okay, what's next? Think, which suggests that I was really more cut out for type design than I was for novel writing.
Well, we're certainly glad to have you in the world of type design.
Well, thank you very much. But eventually I wound up working as a generalist graphic designer, mostly corporate, until around 2008. When the downturn hit, I was the creative director of FAO Schwartz, which was another bit of a detour because I wound up starting to design toys while I was there because there wasn't really anybody else on staff who was able to do it. It was a great deal of fun. Mm-hmm. I still miss that.
I bet.
And then the downturn hit. I was out of a job and I stayed out of a job. And in point of fact, I have never had another job. And while I was calling people and not having them return my calls and emailing people and not having them return my emails, and incidentally, Kirsten and I had just had our first son 3 months before, Kirsten said, well, you got some time on your hands. Why don't you finish up that text typeface you've been working on since before I knew you? And that was how it started. And that's how I got into type design. And that's where I've stayed.
What was the text type design that you had been working on that you then set your attention to?
It was called Spinoza. And I sold it to Font of blessed memory. And the fact that it was well received, I got an ISTD award, made me feel like, okay, this is something I can do. And the nice thing about type design is that the number of people who can do type design is a lot smaller than the number of people who can do graphic design. At that point, I was naive enough to think that the market was less saturated. Of course, these days, that no longer seems to be the case. But that was the beginning. And I figured if I can do this one and get it out there and have it well received, maybe this is something I can continue to do going forward, where I'm a little bit more in demand than I apparently am as a middle-aged creative director.
Yet another parallel. I gave up on graphic design at approximately 2006, 2007, because I didn't feel like I was getting anywhere.
Wow.
And I chose to over-specialize, which was my thing at the time, is that I was going to over-specialize and take a risk on it and pay attention to the part of the design process that I liked the most, which was typography. So I moved to Europe, studied type design in England, and felt like I should have started that 15 years earlier because it was the right thing. But I think you are not alone among type designers I've met over the years who's had a wayward path into the field, because I think until the last maybe 10 or 15 years, type design was not one of those professions that was on the table as a thing that you might pursue. It was so specialized, it didn't come up a lot. And a lot of people seem to have found their way into it from a variety of vectors. Mm-hmm. And you've certainly had a colorful path. So when you finally hung out your shingle, did you have an idea of what the business of running a foundry would look like?
Well, first of all, thank you for assuming that I currently know what the business of running a foundry looks like. Like a lot of type designers, like most type designers, I'm not strong on the business side. That is something that I'm constantly trying to improve on. But I was more focused on the retail side because that was the part of the type business that I'd been exposed to from the other end. I had no idea about the world of bespoke typefaces. Certainly had no idea about OEM licensing. I just thought, well, you draw these things and you put them up on MyFonts and you pray, which I think is still the modus operandi for quite a lot of type designers.
I agree. I think that, in a way, that's sort of the easiest gamble to take to get a start working in it, is you make something and you make it available to the world and see how people respond. And, over time, other opportunities present themselves, particularly as you get better known. And, your sense of what the business is grows as your presence within it develops over time, I would say. As far as starting to work on typefaces, so you had this encouraging start with Spinoza. What were the first inspirations for what your short list of projects would turn into? Where were the ideas coming from?
They were coming from all over. Because, if you look around, you can see that civilization is very largely composed of letter forms. Type is one of the basic building blocks of civilization. Human civilization is built on language and on the communication of knowledge. In order to communicate knowledge at scale, you can't write things out with a crow quill pen. You cannot call somebody over and tell them something. You've got to have a way to mass produce the written word. That's type. So without type, we don't have medicine as we now know it, law, science as we now know it, let alone literature. The internet certainly would not exist without, somebody has to put captions under the memes. So it's just something that is woven into absolutely everything. And once you have the kink in your head that you require to be a type designer, because you really do have to be an otaku, you really do have to be an obsessive in order to do this. You have to care passionately about tiny, tiny details in something that most people barely notice. But once you are there, there's just never, at least for me, any shortage of inspiration. What I did after Spinoza, which was a fairly large workhorse serif, where I was trying very, very hard to strive for clarity and a bit of neutrality and to make something that was intensely readable. And I had worked on it on and off for 11 years before I published it. It was not something that I sat down and drew. The whole tail end of my graphic design career, I was working on this in the evenings. I decided I wanted to have some fun, and I drew something called Vibro, which was the absolute opposite. It was a single weight, it was all caps, and it was made entirely out of parallel stripes and geometric arcs and straight lines, sort of an op art typeface. And it was a blast, and I designed the first iteration of it in something like 6 weeks. And it was very freeing, and it made me think, okay, I can do a lot of different things. That wound up getting a TDC certificate of excellence and made me think, yeah, Spinoza being well received was not a fluke. It's not a typeface that has a multiplicity of uses, but I've been surprised at the way it's continued to be used over the years. And eventually, I think it's earned out in terms of the hours I put into it.
Well, and I think what I respond to about particularly the accented characters in Vibro, and Vibro is full of playfulness, but those characters in particular require so much novel thinking about how to hold the concept together as the structures get more complicated, that they end up with these really very successful and fun solutions to it, which I think raises the level of what the typeface achieves to a really notable place.
Well, thank you.
This is why I was excited to talk to you today, Max, because I think that as type designers, we have a chance to really get into some of the nuts and bolts of how typefaces come together, because we have been grappling with a lot of the same problems over the years from the sound of it. So I hope we can really get into some of the nitty gritty in a way that we don't always get to in these conversations.
I do think a lot about this stuff, but a lot of what I do in type is I feel the opposite of thoughtful, in that a shape looking balanced or unbalanced, looking right or not right, a curve looking true or untrue, I think a lot of it really bypasses the logical part of the brain, and it's more of a gut thing. You push things around until they feel right, until you sort of go, uh-huh. One of the things that I have found to be useful when I work is to mutter to myself. to make noises. May I just say, people out there, do not marry a type designer. Do not marry a type designer. You will regret it. Because sometimes I don't know whether I'm on the right track or the wrong track until I hear myself go, uh-huh, or nah.
It's one of those crafts where I don't think you can anticipate at the beginning what solutions you will arrive at. I always explain when I'm talking about type design to students, say that it's an endless series of cheats. You think there are rules to follow, but then you have to break every one of the rules because you really are relying more on your gut reactions and your perceptual skills in particular. So the process can feel a little bit murky because it doesn't necessarily follow a strict theoretical regimen all the way through.
I fully agree. Andy Warhol said art is what you can get away with. And I absolutely believe that type design is what you can get away with.
But then you also need to be conscious of what is successful as you evaluate what you've done.
Mm-hmm.
So that you can kind of hang on to the spirit of what you're, eventually going to produce. It's quite a balancing act between the gut and the eye and the brain, each sort of serving as a check against the other parts of the formula the whole way through.
Mm-hmm.
Who are some of the type designers that you really looked to for inspiration or, to ideas about how to approach projects?
Inspiration and ideas about how to approach projects, that for me, that would be two different things. I would say my chief inspiration, my North Star, would be Hermann Zapf. He is someone, when I was first as a kid becoming aware of type as a thing, some of the very first typefaces I became aware of were Melior, were Optima, were Palatino. And that was studying them and thinking, why does this work? Why do I have the feeling reading this that I get? It's like listening to a beautiful voice is what drew me in. And the way that he approached his profession, the constant industry, the enormous number of typefaces that he designed in pre-digital days when it was a much more laborious process, the rigor he brought to every single one, the fact that he was constantly trying to absorb new ideas into middle age, into old age, that he was constantly seeing what does each new technology open up in terms of formal possibilities? What does it suggest for a way forward? He just seemed like such an incredibly admirable member of the profession. And from what I've heard, an absolute gentleman. I mean, I've never heard of anyone who had a bad word to say about Zapf. And I love a lot of the stuff he's done, in spite of the fact that as a working graphic designer, I virtually never used what he did because it was already moving out of fashion in the corporate world I worked in by the time I was active enough to be making type choices. So that would be a huge inspiration. But in terms of how to approach individual projects, there's too many people for me to list. There's such an enormous number of good type designers, some of them quite young, that I'm always looking to see what they're coming up with, reading their documentation and their process stories and saying, how did you get there? What can I learn from this lovely thing that you've just done?
It's interesting that you talk about being inspired by Zapf's engagement with technology. Hermann Zapf to me is rightly given credit for his incredible calligraphic skills and background. But I think that skill often overshadows discussion about how really good he was at engaging with technology and trying to bring that thinking into other media. I mean, I've researched, say, the typeface that he developed with Donald Knuth to
Euler, yes,
help work on his Metafont program.
Yes.
So, a very interesting collaboration about bringing together a new technology and an exploration of what it could do with these classical ideas. But I'm really a fan of Zapf's typefaces for sort of late phototype, early digital era. Like, I'm glad that you named Melior, for instance, which I really like. I'm really drawn to those kind of rectangular but very elegant typefaces that he worked on for this stretch of time, where he was really grappling with type being produced for different media suddenly, and him trying to like achieve that same level of formal quality with this whole new range of challenges to address.
Yeah, that's one of the things that particularly impressed me. I mean, Zapf was, in almost anyone's estimation, one of the greatest calligraphers who ever lived. In terms of pure hand skills, he was the Michael Jordan of writing. I mean, you look at some of the stuff he did, sometimes at insanely small sizes, and say, that's not possible. Humans can't do that. So he had reached this level of mastery, and it would be completely understandable for him to cling to it and make everything calligraphic for all his life, except he wouldn't do that. When you're talking about the Euler project, it's the most amazing thing. I mean, here's a guy who became a master of a certain set of techniques, and then new techniques came in. You know, type with vectors came in, bitmaps came in, and instead of saying, well, I'm going to ignore this, or I'm going to try to make this follow the logic of calligraphy, you know, he was saying, let's do this. Let's get into this. Teach me about this. Where can this go that calligraphy can't? And that is just so impressive to me. And again, one of the reasons that I idolize him.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great spirit to approach, I think, the craft of type design with, because the landscape technologically keeps shifting for one reason or another. And it has, certainly at a greater and greater pace throughout, say, the 20th century and into the 21st. And I think that a good approach for type design is to consider yourself as being in a position of, you always have to be ready to learn, and you always have to adapt and approach those challenges with some energy and creativity, and not think of them as an impediment to you doing the work as you thought it was supposed to go.
Mm-hmm.
So as you've developed your own library over the years, have you had that kind of experience of having to perhaps reframe how you thought the process worked, or, you know, address totally new challenges that led to a different way of thinking about it?
I would say a lot less than Zapf ever did, because I've basically been working in vector-based. I mean, I started graphic design a long time ago. My first full-time job, I was literally taking, you know, hot type galleys and spraying them with fixative so that the ink wouldn't run, and then sticking them down to illustration board. And then it was, you know, and then it was phototype. And then it was digital type. And I remember digital type coming in and being the first one in the studio to be given a Mac and being told, here's a Mac and here's a PageMaker. Can you make something out of this? And thinking, oh my God, this is fantastic. I never have to mark up another manuscript. I never have to cast off another manuscript. I have complete control. I can rag the copy the way I want. I don't have to deal with somebody else's judgment on this. But in terms of making the stuff full time, it's been one vector program or another. There have been people who have come up with technologies for determining the optimal side bearings and kerning, and I've fiddled with that a little bit. But unlike Zapf, I am a bit of a technophobe. It is very difficult for me to wrap my head around a new technology, and I have not been able to take it far enough to make it a part of my working process. I always think, well, maybe the next one. It hasn't happened yet.
It's a bit of an unfair question, because we have been living in an era of vector-based, open type-based typographic technology for, you know, about 30 years now, 25, 30 years. And, you know, there are a lot of things that happen within that, but the medium feels generally the same. But I think you did answer what I was getting at, which is that your overall background in design and typography has seen shifts in the media and the process, and your understanding of typography, even if you are expressing it with vectors, your understanding of how type performs is informed by these shifts that have happened over the years. So you can make decisions that still respond to where we are now because you understand that it's part of a larger scope of how things behave and how they could have been made.
It is true. I will say that in terms of learning from the new, it's a lot less about technology for me than it is current practice. It's more a matter of the stylistic landscape for me, looking and seeing how the various cultures and subcultures use type and what sorts of type they use, so that what I do can hopefully be relevant. I think it's part of every designer's job to study trends, not so that you can make trendy things necessarily, but so that you can understand the context in which your own stuff will have to work. You know, I am getting to be an old fart right now, and there's nothing more uncomfortable than some old dude who is trying to seem young and hip. And so I don't want to do that. But what I'm trying to do as much as possible is to make stuff that will work in the context of younger, hipper practitioners. And it has to be something, as I get older and do more of this, I have to understand, it has to be something I can do with conviction. I can't look at the latest thing and say, yeah, I'm going to do something like that if I'm not feeling it in my solar plexus. You know, it's just not going to work. But I think part of rummaging around in my own gut to see what will correspond to different parts of the present moment, I think that's part of the process that makes interesting things happen. The most recent thing I designed, which I am just re-releasing right now, is a face called Reckham, which very much responds to making stuff that will work in the greatest number of contexts. Most of what I've done for the Signal library, both alone and with collaborators, has been pretty classical. And I very much wanted to do things that were as useful as possible for the greatest number of people. So there's Ballinger, a big Neogrot family. There's Field Gothic, an absolutely gargantuan 128 style Neogrot family. Tenon is a collaboration with my friend and colleague Sean Mungy, which is halfway between a grot and a geometric, but that's also meant to be very plain and useful. Dashiell would be a minion style serif workhorse, something that's meant to be good for books, good for editorial, good for branding. But more recently, I've wanted to start leaning into forms that have less to do with the desire to provide tools for other designers and that have a little bit more to do with scratching personal itches, simply because there are so many grots out there. There are so many geometrics out there. There are so many serifs out there. The market is so super saturated. I feel like the only way you can do something that people will use in preference to something else is to dig as deep into yourself as possible, as woo-woo as that sounds. Like, you know, I draw really well. So do a bunch of other people.
Yeah.
What typeface can I design that isn't weird and eccentric, but that if I didn't design it, nobody else could, or that I could design better than anything else?
Exactly.
Reckham came out of that. It started out with my fascination with the Scotch Roman form. But instead of being a good boy and a dutiful student and somebody who doesn't want to frighten the horses at any time, when I was drawing it, I let myself be a little bit more willful. There are some shapes in there, some moves in there that are just sort of like, because I want to. That's why, you know? You don't have to like it. This is what I like. If you look at the W, the serifs, the center and left-hand serifs run together. The tail of the Y, the lowercase y, is vertical. There are places where I went from curves to straight lines. And I think going from curve to straight and back again is one of the biggest parts of type design. And I wasn't polite or nice about it. I made it more abrupt than I ordinarily would, just to create a little bit of extra energy. And I didn't worry so much about whether this was going to be palatable to everybody else. I just knew it was something that I really wanted to draw and that I could draw with complete conviction.
And things like that unusual W are what really give the overall design its sparkle.
Well, thanks. I hope so. While I was fiddling around with it, trying to figure out what degree of contrast to apply and making a bunch of variations, I hit on the idea of doing something in 4 different degrees of contrast, from an ultra high contrast Didone style to a monoline typeface. It looks more or less like typewriter type in the lighter weights, and is kind of Clarendon or Egyptian in the bolder weights. And the fact that these forms had to work across such a range of weights and contrasts, again, that sort of pushes you out past the point where you are solving the problems you expected. You have to solve unexpected problems.
That's when your gut and your experience and your point of view are kind of the only things that you have to rely on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And sometimes you think, am I going to be able to draw my way out of this? There's the old famous Bowie quote about how when you've waded in so deep that your feet can't quite touch the bottom anymore, that's when interesting things start to happen.
Yes.
So I spent, a year and change on Reckham, and it needs to sell licenses. I wasn't doing something just to amuse myself. I do have a family to support. But at the same time, I wanted to wade out a little deeper. And instead of simply trying to make the ideal tool for as many designers as possible, I wanted there to be a bit more of a tension between making a useful tool and just doing what I goddamn well wanted.
I think the dynamic certainly is different from one designer to another, but a library typeface, say something that's going to represent your point of view, that's going to sit in your collection, those ideas tend to need to simmer for a little bit longer. When you are not solving a concrete specific problem, you do have to leave the space for these other ideas to sort of filter their way into a project. I've always found it to be very different from the process of doing custom work, where there's kind of a clear brief and there's a problem that you can solve. Have you had a similar
absolutely
kind of relation to the work that way?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons that I like custom work so much is that the client doesn't want something when I feel fully satisfied with it. The client wants something in 3 months. And so I need to get my house in order creatively very quickly. I need to get some test words that I can live with, that they can live with, that I can fully believe in. I'm going to pretend that every single time the client signs off on a test word, it is something I can fully believe in. It generally is. Yeah. And then I'm going to execute. I'm not wandering the laneways thinking sublime thoughts. I am making a beeline first for the tight beta that the client can play with, which is, I generally promise, 6 weeks in. And then 6 weeks after that, you've got to ship. It's got to be 1.0.
Yeah. There are clear boundaries so you can make more solid decisions.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes I really like what I do under almost a degree of coercion. There's a job that I did for the Irish Independent with Mark Porter. It's a 4-weight typeface. At the moment, no italics. I'm dying to draw italics, but that wasn't part of the brief. That was wrapped up moderately quickly, and there were a lot of people talking about the test words and what they ought to look like. And it got very focused very fast because it had to. And one of the nice things is that I had collaborators there, and I would count the client group as collaborators as well. They were some of the loveliest, smartest clients I've worked with. I mean, we just got on really well, and each of us knew what we knew, and we knew what we didn't know and where we were going to listen to somebody else who knew better.
Yeah.
We were able to lock down a direction early on. And, I am as happy with that typeface as I am with anything I've ever drawn. And it happens so much faster than if it were the product of a long creative journey.
It's not a less creative process. It's more that you have to decide faster and commit. And then your creativity focuses on the direction that's been established rather than wandering the landscape, hoping to get just the right something to come together.
I think that's true. And so alternating between client work and self-initiated work, I love that. I like a practice where you mix it up a little.
Well, it keeps you sharp.
It does. And I mean, you don't want to be turning the crank and making another one. Also, collaboration of any sort, you're bringing in other points of view. You've got people suggesting things you would never in a thousand years have thought of yourself. And it takes you places you couldn't get on your own.
For your library projects, have you been surprised by the way they've been received by people? I mean, have you had unexpected hits or work that you were excited about that the public at large felt less excited about?
Let's see. I would say that so far, I mean, some of the stuff in my library, I just did because I really wanted to do it. And I didn't expect great commercial success, like Vibro. I didn't know if anyone would ever license that thing. And in point of fact, it's not like there have been huge numbers of people licensing it, but it's been out there for, I don't know what, 12, 13 years now. I added a lowercase at a certain point. And if I added it all up, I probably made an okay hourly rate drawing it. Other things that I've drawn because I really, really wanted to. There's a typeface, we're back to Bowie, called Glamo. I started drawing it as part of an invitational poster project for Dublin Bowie Fest. Each of the invited artists and designers was to design a single poster based on one of Bowie's, I think it was 27 studio albums. And I was given Black Tie, White Noise, which I wasn't terribly familiar with, and which is, I don't think, one of his stronger albums. And I was thinking about the 90s. I was thinking about societal decay, new technologies. I was thinking about the Designers Republic. And I was thinking about Akira. And I drew this weird, blobby, grid-based, very, very black face for this poster, where I actually set the entire lyrics of the title track along the bottom edge. And like I said, it was one of these things that I just sort of stumbled into and didn't know how to get out of except by finishing it. I would say that that is probably unique in my library in that absolutely no one has ever licensed it. Not one. That thing has not made me a single thin dime. But, you know, who knows what's going to happen in the future. Back in the early days, I would draw a typeface and release a typeface, wait a few months and think, oh God, it's a dud. It's not going to happen. And a year would go by and it was sitting on the servers, and then it began to pick up, and then it began to pick up. And pretty soon it was one of the tent poles of the Foundry. I find that typefaces take a long time to bed in.
Every typeface designer probably hopes that every typeface that's not immediately awarded with praise and success finds its moment sometime in the future, and suddenly royalties begin to appear when you least expect it. Part of what's nice about being able to create a library that exists is that it is available so that it's ready for the moment that it could be right for.
Mm-hmm. I fully agree. Along with the fact that, you know, my kids eat a lot, there's the fact that you make type to be used.
Yes.
You want to see it used. So yeah, I would love to see Glamo out there at some point. Maybe I'll have to do it myself.
You did mention the idea of a tentpole typeface. Do you have one family that is wildly more successful than the rest?
No, and that surprises me because when I started learning about the business, I was told that generally speaking, you have one, maybe two families that are going to do all the business. And right now, I would say that Signal is at least a tripod in that Ballinger does very well, Field Gothic does very well. Again, Field Gothic sat on the servers for a year, and finally was invited to the dance and now is doing very, very well. Dashiell and Tenon also. Tenon is doing quite well. Yeah, I would say the bigger earners would be between 2 and 4 typefaces, and the rest just bits and pieces.
Yeah.
But each one of them is finding its own way. There's a typeface called Precio I did, oh God, a long time ago that never really did much business, and for some bizarre reason is beginning to pick up now. The royalty statements will come in, the Adobe statements will come in, and I'm thinking, really? Precio? Well, okay then.
That's good to hear. I asked the question because that's been the experience for a lot of foundries, is that there's often one, possibly two families that essentially subsidize the rest of the work because they are sort of runaway hits. They're usually a sans serif, which is why I'm also very happy to hear that Dashiell is doing very well for you.
Yeah.
But it's nice that you've got a good spread of things that are performing well. That's really encouraging.
It feels terrific. Generally speaking, I also find, it's usually a sans serif. And Dashiell probably does not earn as well as Field or Ballinger, although one of the things about Field is there's so damn many styles of it, it's operating in a different weight class. But yeah,
that also helps.
There's a tremendous hegemony of Neogrots right now, and you get a bit tired. I made a decision a few years back that I was going to stop for a while, at least, a few years, drawing Neogrots unless somebody specifically paid me, because there's enough. Signal has enough. And I try to focus on the serif end of things because I feel like it's less thoroughly strip-mined at this point. One of the things about the type business that is there's a constant tension in that basically the things that sell really well tend to be closer to neutral or bland, things that are idiosyncratic, things that are more highly stylized, very seldom do a lot of business. At the same time, you can't just draw what you think has a shot at being a bestseller because your soul dies within you. So yeah, there's that constant back and forth between what do I want to draw and what realistically will support my family over its useful life for the length of time it takes me to draw it.
Yeah. I think the idiosyncratic projects tell the world more about who you are, and then perhaps the more conservative projects or the more neutral ones at least provide something for people to use and, put their own stamp on the work that they make with those typefaces. But I think if you had an all-neutral library, no one would really know why they should come to you necessarily for any reason. The really interesting stuff, at least, is like you shining up your light in the forest, and then all the projects are there for people to see the quality of what you can do once you've caught their attention. So I think that balance of having the really unusual original stuff with the really versatile stuff is very important for a foundry's whole collection of work.
I absolutely agree. And I think Paul Barnes said something very interesting about that. Paul Barnes, a commercial type, he was talking about his hairline type family.
Marion?
Yes.
I love them.
They are absolutely gorgeous. But he said while he released them to an interview, I think for iMagazine, he said, we don't expect anybody to license them, but it's a little bit like, haute couture. It's a little bit like the fashion that you see on the runway. It looks fantastic. It draws a lot of eyeballs. It gets press, but no one's going to buy that stuff. You're hoping that they're going to see that and come in and buy a pair of black slacks.
Yeah.
And I think that is very true. One of the things about releasing is that releasing is marketing. And one reason that for most of the stuff I do, I tend to develop an MVP and then expand it later is that every single time I add to a typeface, that's another reason to make an announcement. and in other people to remind folks that it's out there. I think, generally speaking, type marketing has been about getting all your ducks in a row and then presenting the typeface with a big flourish. And in my experience, nobody goddamn cares. As a branding designer, every client that I've ever had just about thinks that they are going to bring out the new branding and people's jaws will drop and everybody will be so excited. And I always tell them, just roll out the project. Don't talk about it. Any attention you get is going to be bad attention. That's not what it's about. And I think the same is definitely true in type design. So I prefer to just have an incremental approach where I'm always bringing out something or expanding something. It gives you another reason to talk to people.
Max, it was really nice getting to talk to you today about the business, about the craft. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And hopefully people will check out Signal Type and see the results of all of this thoughtfulness and skill that you've made available.
Thank you, Dan.
To check out Max's work, head to his website, signalfoundry.com, and check out the newly expanded version of Max's Reckham family from Signal Type on MyFonts and Monotype Fonts.
Thanks for listening. If you like our show, please subscribe, rate us, and share us with a friend. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It's produced by Christopher Olin and Mia Sullivan. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Take care.